Many years ago, I went by Walter Colby's blacksmith shop, Clarence Brackley. Now, Clarence was the salt of the earth. He was a farmer, lived up in Freeman Center, worked hard all his life, side by side with his wife, and they were successful farmers at the time. And he had been there at Walt's blacksmith shop ever since the middle of forenoon, hoping to get his horses shod. Well, Walter was one of the most capable men in any position you put him: carpenter, blacksmith, woodworker, machinist, and he was good. He did have one habit that was a little bad, and he did like to drink alcoholic beverages, and sometimes in excess. Clarence had been there since the middle of forenoon, as I said, to get his horses shod. Walter was in no condition to shoe them, and he knew it, Clarence knew it, and so they just let the day pass away. Finally, along in the evening, Walter was in a condition good enough to shoe the horses. As I rode by the shop, saw the lights on. I didn't know but something was going on. Being a young boy, probably in the late teens, I stopped, drove in, walked in, and I said, "Walt, you're working a little overtime tonight, aren't you?" Walt promptly answered. He says, "Well, Virgil," he said, "when you got a customer, that's the time to do business." And he was doing business. Another story I would like to read with you is back in the railroad days, Ed West was one of the senior engineers, and Fred Levitt was a junior engineer. And they worked together pretty well on the railroad, and but as times got hard in the Depression years and the railroad was nearly down to the last end, they had to lay off some people, and some of the junior engineers had to become firemen. And this time, why, Fred Levitt was a junior engineer, so he had to fire. On his first trip down Phillips to Farmington on Monday morning, he was rather out of sorts, and justifiably so. He was a good engineer and had worked long and faithful for the railroad. They got down to the station, and where the platform was for the passengers to alight from the railroad car, the engineer could not see it, as he was on the right side of the cab. And the fireman was on the left side, and it was his duty to make a signal when the engineer should stop the train for proper alignment. He did, and Levitt probably fouled up a little bit purposely on the signal to stop, and the train did go by a little bit. And Fred says, no, you got to back up, you've gone too far. So he backed up, and Fred made another signal, and he did, and he said, oh, no, he says, you backed up too much. Now go ahead just a little bit. So he went ahead a little bit, and Fred made a third signal, and they stopped the train, and he says, now how is that, Mr. Levitt? And Fred says, that's good. Now he says, one more question. Fred, how is it for sideways? And there was a lot of stories about the old railroad. This same Ed West was shifting cars at the Strong Depot one time, and he had to go by the New England Creamery, and Don McEdwards was a hellraiser from way back. and a real nice guy, but he just did like to raise a little bit of the dickens. And he was cleaning out the creamery. It was a hot summer day. He was cleaning out the creamery, and he had an 1.5 inch hose that he was using, and just cleaning the floor and the walls and any spots where any milk or cream was left that day. And he kept right on going. And and when Levitt come by with his, when Ed came by with the engine, why, he let him have it right through the cab door. And when he did that, naturally, why, Ed got very wet. There was nothing said, and he didn't do anything to change the attitude of people. And however, in about 2 days, he was in there again, and he had the engine turned around so that the cinder ejector was on the side toward the creamery. And when he got right in front of the creamery door, he opened the valve and blew his cinders into the creamery. Edwards had a little job cleaning it up that day. Another incident involving this same Don McEdwards, it was his duty to see that things were run in orderly fashion, and that the milk and cream was kept cool. Now these were the days before electric refrigeration was available, and the farmers that were producing milk did put up ice in an ice and their so-called ice house, and they covered it with sawdust, and they through the winter months, and they would put in a good stock of ice, and hopefully enough to run through the hot summer months and keep the milk and cream cold until it was picked up by the transporter. And the transporter in those days was usually in, I believe, 5 or 10 gallon cans, and by horses and wagons. The area inspector was coming around to the farms, and Don McEdwards was showing him the individual farms and introducing him to the farmer producers. Well, now, one Wesley Stinchfield did not put up quite ice enough that year to go through. And they were traveling around on a warm day in late September. Now, Stinchfield had done a commendable job for what he had to do. He had a deep well, and the water in that was about 42 degrees. And he did change that water several times each day, and kept the milk down to a pretty reasonable temperature. So Don knew that. The inspector didn't know it. And when they arrived, they went into the milk room. Don was a heavy-set man, probably go for about 240, thereabouts, very athletic, rugged. And he jumped up and sat on the top of the milk tank. And he introduced Stinchfield to the inspector. And they looked things over in good shape. They talked and passed the time of day. And the inspector said, "You have plenty of ice left, Mr. Stinchfield." Don said, "Oh yes, Wes always puts in plenty of ice." Whereupon the inspector realized that the time was valuable and he had to go on to the next place. So with that in mind, they went on. Don did get off in the milk tank, and Stinchfield went back to putting more cold water in. Another story of interest that I think of right now is May Armstrong used to have a farm up at the crossroads at the top of Norton Hill. She had a poultry farm, and she did really a pretty big business. But these were Depression years, and she had 2 men that lived there and helped her with the wood pile and the egg gathering and everything that went with a poultry farm. And one of them was Clayton Crocker. And Clayton was a very industrious man, a very good man, and he worked in a running rate all day long. He would get an armful of wood and bring it out of the cut down that they had adjacent to the farm, and rather than walk to the farm, he would run to the farmhouse. He would run to the farmhouse with the armful of wood. And that is the way he worked from dawn till dusk. And one time there was several hunters come up from Brunswick, and they were going over to Vern Richardson's cottage on Taylor Hill and do some hunting. But they came on Saturday night, and they planned to get the camp organized on Sunday. And they realized they wouldn't have any game by that time, so they thought it wise if they bought some dressed poultry. They went into Fred Daggett's store and asked if he had any poultry left. Now this was maybe 7 or 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. And Fred says, "No, sir," he says, "I haven't. I sold the last one this afternoon." And one of the gentlemen there was Vern Richards, who was a native of the town. And he said, "Fred, where could I get some?" He says, "You might get some up to May Armstrong. She usually keeps a few ahead, all dressed." So they drove into the yard, May Armstrong's place. When they got there, why, Clayton was in front there and running with an armful of wood. And he said, "How many?" And then held up his 2 fingers, wanted 2. I guess I got ahead of my story a little bit. Actually, the egg business didn't quite support them during the Depression years, and they manufactured a little home brew and occasionally would sell a bottle, or maybe 2. And at this particular time, Clayton said, I repeat, Clayton says, "How many?" Then indicated 2, and Clayton came out with 2 Moxie bottles filled with home brew. And I'm sure knowing Vern, being hunting and one thing or another, that they much appreciated it and probably did go on and buy a couple of dressed poultry at the same time. Another man that lived on that farm was Oat Master. Oat was helped about the farm. He didn't use quite the speed that Clayton used, but he was reliable, and he kept pushing all day long. And but he did have an ulcerated tooth, and he made a telephone call to Dr. Fred Lovejoy in Farmington and asked him if he could pull a tooth for him if he came down. And Dr. Lovejoy says, "Well, I'll take a look at it." So Oat got on the noon train, went to Farmington, walked up to the doctor's office, and the doctor looked at the tooth, decided that it was okay to pull it. So he says, what do you want to take for it?" And Oat, in this stuttering manner, he says, "I already took it." And he had took it. Many years ago, in the days when Strong had a drugstore formerly owned by Charles Dyer and later by Roy Lewis, that institution had about 6 chairs out in back of a magazine rack. They sold, of course, being a drugstore, they sold magazines along with bicycles and some hardware items. And they gathered out people gathered out back there in the evening, and in back of the magazine rack, they were out of sight of the trade, and they could talk things over in good shape. And one evening there, which was the evening just prior to the annual town meeting on Saturday morning, there was several in there. Among them was Dan Pratt. Now Dan was a good man. He was a smart man, but he did like to bring humor into town meeting, and he always enjoyed getting a laugh. While they were in there talking with some others, one fellow came in with the name of Eddie Goodwin. Eddie was a devil. He liked to get people into trouble, and so he went about setting up whoever would listen to him that night. And it seems that the town of Strong had a Caterpillar tractor. It was an ID6. And about a 1935 or 6 model, if I recall. He did, and Eddie had run the tractor on several seasons, and Ken Robbins had all run it. But this particular winter, why, Frank Spencer was running it. Now Frank was a young kid. He was only, I think, 18 or 19 years old. And he did a commendable job with it. And he was mechanically and industrially inclined, and he did a good job. So Eddie said, in front of the group in there, he said, "Any of you fellas going to town meeting tomorrow?" And several of them answered in the affirmative. And Eddie says, "I wish you'd bring up that business of the Spencer boy driving that town tractor around on 3 cylinders all winter long." And that was just enough. And they took care of Dan in good fashion. And he swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And the proper time when winter roads were discussed, he asked then moderator and first selectman F.R. Dean Richardson what the idea was in letting the Spencer boy run the town tractor around all winter long on 3 cylinders. Dean promptly answered. He said, "We bought that in Portland. It was manufactured by the Caterpillar Tractor Company in Peoria, Illinois, and when they manufactured it, they installed 3 cylinders in the engine. If it had 2, we would run it on 2. If it had 4, we would run it on 4. But being as it had 3 cylinders, well, that's what we run it on, and Spencer boy did a good job with it, and he did all right." Dan was laughed down at that time, but Dan took it in good faith, and he realized that he owed one to Eddie Goodwin. I don't know that he ever caught up with Eddie, but I expect he did sometime in the future. Another story concerning Dan Pratt. He was the water commissioner, water superintendent of the Strong Water District for many years, and he was very faithful in his duties. And he went to Day Mountain Pond and inspected that regularly. And that was closed to fishing for several years, and Dan maybe wasn't quite aware of that. And one time Dan went up to the pond, he went fishing, and he asked me to pick him up down at Ray Pinkham's, and where he left his car, and I had a 4-wheel drive truck, and I took him up to the Earl and Richardson's and up to the pond that way, whereupon he walked around the pond, and it was an easy walk back, down, over, or much easier anyway than it would have been to get up there. To climb up, he could climb down a lot easier, so that made him a pretty good trip. And he would get down and get his car and come up and report to me that he was home, so I didn't have any worry about his being up there alone and with a broken leg or something. And occasionally, as he walked around the pond, he might drop a worm in, and the worm would be firmly attached to a hook and a sinker and some line. And on occasion, he would give me a little of the yielded benefits of that trip, and which I was much appreciated. He came up to my office one time after the mill had closed. Everybody had gone home, but the front door was open, and Dan came in, reported in, so I didn't have to worry. I didn't have to worry about getting him back, and he did leave a couple of fish for me. And that time, while we were in there, we were talking about some subject far from the water and far from fishing. I don't know. I don't recall now what the story was, but Dan was talking in a normal voice, and he kept saying, and he kept talking, and Jimmy Espinette, and his kid, 12 years old, came in, and he looked at those fish and said, "Why'd you get those?" And Dan never changed the inflection of his voice at all. He kept right on talking, but he changed the subject immediately. He says, "You know where the McClary Brook comes into the Sandy River down South Strong?" And then he continued on the subject that we were talking about. And the boy stood there a minute or two, and then he went out. Dan and I talked there for 15 to 20 minutes, and that was about the end of the day. He said to me, he says, "Are you busy?" And I said, "No, not particular." And he said, "Can you spare 15, 20 minutes?" And I said, "Certainly." Well, he says, "Get in my car." Well, I got in his car with him, and we rode down to South Strong, and we went where the McClary Brook crossed the road and met the river, and there was young Espinette's bicycle right there, and leaned against the fence in proper position, and I'm sure he was down there fishing, and it was a rather laughable situation because it was a pretty good place to catch suckers. I don't know if he caught any suckers, but I promise you he didn't catch any trout that day. Thinking of Dan Pratt and the water company makes me think of another story, and I might have told you this story before, but it's really a pretty good one. Years later, Pete Norris was the superintendent of the water company, and Pete was a very dedicated superintendent, and in the season of 1979 and 80, we put a new water system in the town of Strong. During that time that we were, the construction company was doing that job, one Brud McPhail drove into town. And Brud had been a high school buddy of Pete Norris, and he later became a lawyer. He was a lawyer living down in Marshfield, Massachusetts. And he drove into town seeing Pete. He said, "What's going on here, Pete? Sewer or water?" And Pete says, "Both." Whereupon Brud says, "Well, I know that people in the town of Strong were smarter than the average bears." And he says, "You're doing it both at once, yeah?" And he said, "Well, that's good. Usually," he says, "they put in one, get everything all smoothed up and replanted and repaved, and then a year later, well, they tear everything up and put in the other one. And you're doing it both at once." He says, "That's good." He says, "How's it going to work, Pete?" And Pete immediately replied, "Water days and sewerage nights." I want to tell you a pretty good story about my brother. Once back in the late 40s, shortly after World War II, my brother bought a Chris Craft boat. It was really a nice boat, and he brought it home on one of the company trucks, and he got several of his cronies, I don't know, boys his age, and they were then in their early to mid-20s probably. And I remember there was Friedel, probably Norman Libby, and maybe Merlin Kingsley, and maybe Al Sudbury, some of those fellows, and he got them to go over and help him unload it out of the truck. And then, so they unloaded it out of the truck and put it in a lake over to Port Lake, and and once they got it in, he said, "Well, you fellows like a ride?" And he thought that would be a fair way of paying them for the lift, and give them riding his boat, new boat. So they all got in, and they started out across the lake, and things were getting a little bit logy, and water was coming up through the floorboards. And so they immediately turned around and headed for shore. They just made it ashore, and water was several inches over the floorboards by that time. And so he said, "Well, I guess this has got to stay in the water and swell up before we use it." So they left the boat on the shore, or close to the shore, and left it to swell overnight, and the next day. And they went over the next evening after work, and there they they took a bilge pump with them that night, and they couldn't pump it out. Well, I guess it would have to swell some more. The second night they went back, and among the boys was an older boy, but he was still a boy, Carol Brackley. And he went over with them, and they looked around. They said they couldn't do anything till it swelled up. They couldn't pump it out that night either. Well, Carol got in, and they looked at it, and he lifted up one of the seat cushions, and in the seat, under the seat cushion he could see the bottom of the pond. And he looked closer, and he says, "Well, Starbird," he says, "I don't think you're ever going to swell up that brass nipple." There was a brass nipple in the bottom of the boat for draining, and and the plug was not put in. So they put the plug in, and then they were able to pump it out, and they did get a boat ride. And if it hadn't been for Brackley, well, probably that boat would have still been over there on the shore, trying to get swelled up so they could, so it would float. There again, the brass nipple is a slow thing to shrink. Ralph Cook came into the old lumber company office one morning. He was living down in the Hotel Strong, and that was long after it had been used as a hospital, and Foster Manufacturing Company did use it as a boarding home for their health. I asked Ralph that morning, and it was a real cold, rough morning, wind blowing, and probably the temperature was close to 40 below. And I said, "Ralph, how cold was it down your end of the town this morning?" He said, "Oh, I thought it was awful cold." He says, "That moment I went down and took 6 clapboard right off the bottom of the stable."